Sarah Mitchell had always been the type of person who put others before herself. Growing up in a small town in Ohio, she learned from her grandmother that helping people wasn't just something you did when it was convenient. It was something you did because it was right. This belief followed her through nursing school, through her early career at the local hospital, and eventually led her to volunteer for a medical mission that would change her life forever. The opportunity came through a partnership between her hospital and the military. They needed experienced nurses to provide medical support at a forward operating base in Afghanistan. The pay wasn't much better than her regular job, but Sarah wasn't thinking about money. She was thinking about the soldiers who needed care, far from home and family. Her friends thought she was crazy to leave her comfortable life for a war zone, but Sarah saw it differently. These were people who had chosen to serve their country, and she wanted to serve them. The flight to Afghanistan felt endless. Sarah pressed her face against the small airplane window, watching the landscape change from the familiar green fields of home to the stark, mountainous terrain of a country at war. Her stomach churned with a mixture of excitement and fear. She had treated trauma patients before, but never in a place where the trauma was still happening around her. When she arrived at Forward Operating Base Chapman, the heat hit her like a wall. Even in the early morning, the temperature was already climbing toward triple digits. The base was a sprawling collection of tan-colored buildings, concrete barriers, and dust. Everything was covered in a fine layer of sand that seemed to get into every crevice. Sarah hefted her medical bag and followed the other arriving personnel toward the main building. Captain James Rodriguez was the first person to greet her. He was younger than she expected, probably in his late 20s, with kind eyes that seemed older than his years. "Welcome to Chapman," he said, extending a calloused hand. "I'm Rodriguez, but everyone here calls me Doc, though I'm not the medical kind of doctor." He smiled at his own joke. "I'll be your liaison and basically your guardian angel while you're here." Sarah liked him immediately. There was something about his easy confidence that made her feel safer. "Sarah Mitchell," she replied, shaking his hand. "And I'm very glad to meet you." Rodriguez showed her around the base, pointing out the mess hall, the medical tent where she would be working, and the sleeping quarters. "The work here is different from what you're used to," he explained as they walked. "Sometimes it's quiet for days, and sometimes all hell breaks loose at once. The important thing is to stay calm and remember that everyone here is counting on each other." The medical facility was more sophisticated than Sarah had expected. They had proper surgical equipment, plenty of supplies, and even air conditioning. The head nurse, a stern but kind woman named Lieutenant Collins, briefed Sarah on the protocols and introduced her to the rest of the medical team. There were 4 other nurses, 2 doctors, and several medics. They all had the same look in their eyes, professional competence mixed with the kind of weariness that came from seeing too much. Sarah's first week passed in a blur of routine medical calls. Soldiers came in with everything from minor cuts and infections to more serious injuries from training accidents. She quickly learned that the military had its own culture, its own way of doing things. The soldiers were polite but distant at first, testing her to see if she could handle the pressure and the environment. It was during her second week that Sarah first witnessed the kind of emergency that made her understand why she was really there. The alarm sounded at 3 in the morning, a harsh electronic wail that cut through the desert silence. Sarah bolted upright in her narrow bunk, her heart racing. She could hear shouting outside and the sound of vehicles moving fast. Lieutenant Collins burst through the door of the women's quarters. "We've got incoming wounded," she called out. "IED explosion, multiple casualties. Everyone up now." Sarah threw on her uniform and ran to the medical tent. The scene was controlled chaos. Medics were prepping stretchers, doctors were scrubbing in, and the radio crackled with updates from the field. 3 wounded, 1 critical, came the voice from the helicopter. ETA 4 minutes. When the helicopter landed, Sarah got her first real taste of battlefield medicine. The critical patient was a young Marine, barely out of his teens, with shrapnel wounds to his chest and abdomen. His name was Private Johnson, and he was conscious but fading fast. As Sarah worked to stabilize his IV lines, he grabbed her hand with surprising strength. "Am I going to make it?" he whispered, his eyes wide with fear. Sarah looked into those young eyes and made a promise that would define her entire deployment. "You're going to be fine," she said firmly. "I'm going to make sure of it." For the next 6 hours, Sarah worked alongside the surgical team to save Private Johnson's life. It was touch and go several times, but eventually, they stabilized him enough for evacuation to a larger hospital in Germany. As the medical transport helicopter disappeared into the dawn sky, Sarah felt a deep satisfaction. This was why she had come here. Captain Rodriguez found her later that morning, sitting outside the medical tent and watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold. "Heard you did good work last night," he said, settling down beside her on the wooden bench. "We all did," Sarah replied. "That's what teams are for." Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. "You know, Johnson asked me to thank you specifically before they loaded him on the transport. Said you promised him he'd make it and he believed you." He paused, studying her face. "The guys are starting to talk about you. Word gets around fast on a base this size. They're saying you're the kind of nurse who really cares." Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest. Acceptance in this environment meant everything. These soldiers depended on each other for their very lives, and being trusted by them was an honor she didn't take lightly. As the weeks passed, Sarah settled into the rhythm of life at the base. She learned to sleep through the sound of helicopters and to work effectively, even when the generators failed and they had to use flashlights. She discovered that military humor was a survival mechanism, and she learned to give as good as she got when the soldiers teased her about being a civilian. Most importantly, she formed bonds with the people around her. There was Rodriguez, who checked on her every day and made sure she had everything she needed. There was Sergeant Thompson, a tough Marine from Texas who brought her coffee every morning and called her Doc, even though she wasn't a doctor. There was Corporal Williams, barely 22 years old, who showed her pictures of his girlfriend back home and talked about their wedding plans. These weren't just patients or colleagues. They were becoming family. And like family, Sarah would do anything to protect them. 3 months into her deployment, Sarah had found her place at Forward Operating Base Chapman. The initial nervousness had given way to confidence, and the soldiers no longer saw her as an outsider. She had earned their respect through countless late nights patching up injuries, listening to their fears, and never once complaining about the harsh conditions. The base had its own rhythm, and Sarah had learned to read the signs. When the radio chatter increased and officers huddled in urgent conversations, she knew to prepare for incoming casualties. When the helicopters flew out in formation, she knew to expect them back with wounded. When Captain Rodriguez got that particular line between his eyebrows, she knew something big was about to happen. It was Rodriguez who first noticed that Sarah was pushing herself too hard. She had been working 16-hour shifts for 2 weeks straight, catching only brief naps between emergencies. The dark circles under her eyes were getting deeper, and she had started drinking coffee instead of eating meals. "Mitchell," Rodriguez said one evening as Sarah was restocking medical supplies, "when's the last time you took a real break?" Sarah looked up from the inventory sheet she was checking. "I took a break yesterday. I sat down for 10 minutes during lunch." "That's not what I mean, and you know it." Rodriguez crossed his arms, wearing the expression he used when he was about to give someone an order they wouldn't like. "You need to rest, real rest. 8 hours of sleep, a full meal, maybe even a shower that lasts longer than 3 minutes. "There's too much work to do," Sarah protested. "Sergeant Martinez is still recovering from that infection, and we've got 3 new soldiers coming in tomorrow who haven't had their medical clearances updated. Plus, intelligence says there might be increased activity in Sector 7, which means you need to be at full strength when casualties start coming in," Rodriguez interrupted. "You're no good to anyone if you collapse from exhaustion." Sarah wanted to argue, but she could see the concern in his eyes. Rodriguez had become more than just her liaison. He was a friend who genuinely cared about her well-being. Still, the thought of taking time off when people might need her felt wrong. That night, Sarah tried to follow Rodriguez's advice. She went to her bunk at a reasonable hour, had a full dinner, and even read a few pages of the novel her sister had sent her. But sleep wouldn't come. Every sound seemed amplified. The generator humming outside, boots walking past on the gravel, the distant sound of radio communications. She found herself listening for the alarm that would call her back to work. At 2 in the morning, she gave up trying to sleep and went for a walk around the base. The night air was cooler, and the desert sky was filled with more stars than she had ever seen back home. She found herself at the memorial wall, where photographs and small mementos honored soldiers who had been killed in action. Some of the faces looked familiar, soldiers she might have treated during their time at Chapman. "Can't sleep either?" Sarah turned to find Corporal Williams approaching. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee and offered her one. "Thanks," Sarah said, accepting the warm cup gratefully. What's your excuse? Williams shrugged. Same as yours, probably. Brain won't shut off. He gestured toward the memorial wall. Sometimes I come here when I can't sleep. Helps put things in perspective. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, sipping their coffee and looking at the stars. Finally, Williams spoke again. You know, the guys talk about you a lot. Oh no, Sarah said with a small smile. Should I be worried? Nothing bad, Williams assured her quickly. It's just, well, you're different from the other medical staff we've had here. You really care about us, not just as patients, but as people. Like when Sergeant Thompson got that letter about his divorce, you sat with him for 3 hours just listening. Or when Private Garcia was worried about his mom's surgery back home, you helped him get through to the hospital to check on her. Sarah felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment. That's just basic human decency. Maybe, Williams said, but not everyone shows it. The thing is, we know you care about us, which makes us want to take care of you too. But you won't let us. You work yourself to death trying to take care of everyone else, and you never ask for help or take a break. Before Sarah could respond, Williams continued. Rodriguez isn't the only one who's noticed. We all have. And we're worried about you. The simple honesty in his voice touched something deep in Sarah's heart. She'd been so focused on taking care of everyone else that she hadn't realized they were trying to take care of her too. I just want to do my job well, Sarah said quietly. You do, Williams replied firmly. Better than well. But part of doing your job well is making sure you're healthy enough to keep doing it. The next morning brought new challenges that pushed Williams's advice to the back of Sarah's mind. Intelligence reports indicated increased insurgent activity in the area, and the base went on high alert. Sarah could feel the tension in the air as soldiers prepared for possible combat operations. Captain Rodriguez found her in the medical tent, checking equipment for the 3rd time that morning. We're sending out a patrol this afternoon, he said without preamble. Routine reconnaissance, but given the current situation, I want medical support to go with them. Sarah looked up from the blood pressure cuff she was testing. How far out? About 15 kilometers northeast. There's been some suspicious activity near one of the villages, and we need to check it out. Should be a straightforward mission. Go out, take a look around, come back. Who's going for medical? Sarah asked, though she already suspected the answer. You, if you're up for it, Rodriguez said. I know it's not exactly what you signed up for, but you're the most experienced trauma nurse we have. And if something goes wrong out there, the team will need someone who can handle serious injuries in the field. Sarah felt a familiar mixture of fear and excitement. Field medicine was completely different from working in the safety of the base medical facility. Out there, she would have limited supplies, no backup, and potentially hostile forces nearby. But she also knew that if soldiers were going into danger, they deserved to have the best medical care available. When do we leave? She asked. 1400 hours. I'll be leading the patrol, so you'll be with me the whole time. We've got 12 Marines plus you and me. Should be back before dark. Sarah spent the next few hours preparing her field medical kit. She packed extra bandages, morphine, IV fluids, and emergency surgical supplies. Everything had to fit in a backpack that she could carry comfortably over long distances. She also made sure her personal protective equipment was properly fitted and that she knew how to use the radio communication system. As the patrol prepared to leave, Sarah felt the familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach. But there was something else too, a sense of purpose. This was why she had come to Afghanistan. Not just to treat wounded soldiers after they were brought back to safety, but to be there with them when they needed her most. The convoy consisted of 3 armored vehicles, each carrying part of the patrol team. Sarah rode in the lead vehicle with Rodriguez and 3 other soldiers. As they drove through the gates of Forward Operating Base Chapman, Sarah took what she didn't know would be her last look at the place that had become home. The landscape outside the base was harsh and beautiful in its own way. Rocky hills dotted with scrub brush stretched to the horizon, and the afternoon sun cast everything in shades of gold and brown. Sarah had only left the base a few times since arriving, and she was struck again by how different this country was from Ohio. First time on patrol? Asked Sergeant Thompson, who was sitting across from her in the vehicle. First time this far out? Sarah replied. You'll do fine, Thompson said with confidence. Just remember to keep your head down if things get interesting, and stick close to Rodriguez. He's been doing this longer than anyone. As if summoned by the mention of his name, Rodriguez's voice crackled through the radio. All units were approaching the checkpoint.
Stay alert and follow standard protocols.
The patrol moved through the countryside with practiced efficiency. Sarah watched through the reinforced windows as they passed small villages, where children waved at the convoy and elderly men sat in the shade of mud brick buildings. The Marines in her vehicle were alert but relaxed, their weapons ready but not raised. This was routine for them, but for Sarah every detail was new and fascinating. See that hill over there? Sergeant Thompson pointed to a rocky outcrop about a mile to their east. That's where we got hit by mortars last month. Bastards had the range dialed in perfectly, but our air support chased them off before anyone got seriously hurt. Sarah studied the hill, trying to imagine what it must have been like to be under fire in this open terrain. The thought made her stomach clench, but she pushed the fear aside. Fear was natural, but it couldn't control her actions. After an hour of driving, the convoy reached the village they had come to investigate. It looked peaceful enough, a collection of simple buildings clustered around a dusty main street, with a few shops and a small mosque. But Rodriguez was taking no chances. He positioned the vehicles in a defensive formation and divided the patrol into two teams. "Mitchell, you're with me," Rodriguez said as the soldiers dismounted. "We're going to talk to the village elder and see what he knows about the suspicious activity. Keep your medical kit close, but try to look non-threatening. These people have seen too much violence already." Sarah adjusted her backpack and fell into step beside Rodriguez as they walked toward the largest building in the village. Several Marines spread out to provide security, their movements casual but alert. Sarah could feel eyes watching them from doorways and windows, but no one approached. The village elder was a dignified man in his 70s named Hassan. He greeted them with the formal courtesy that Sarah had learned was common in this culture. Through an interpreter, Rodriguez explained that they were investigating reports of unusual activity in the area. Hassan listened carefully, then shook his head. "There have been strangers here," he admitted. "3 nights ago, men came through the village after dark. They did not stop, but they were armed and moving toward the mountains." Rodriguez asked more questions while Sarah observed the interaction. She was struck by the elder's dignity and the obvious respect the Marines showed him. This wasn't an interrogation. It was a conversation between allies trying to solve a mutual problem. As they prepared to leave the village, Sarah noticed a small crowd gathered around one of the buildings. A woman was calling out in distress, and several people were trying to calm her down. "What's happening over there?" Sarah asked the interpreter. The young Afghan man listened to the commotion, then turned back to her with concern. "The woman says her son is very sick. He has been burning with fever for 2 days, and she fears he will die." Sarah looked at Rodriguez. "I'd like to take a look at the boy, if that's okay." Rodriguez hesitated for a moment, then nodded. 5 minutes. We need to get back on schedule." The sick child was 8 years old and clearly in distress. His fever was dangerously high, and Sarah could see the signs of severe dehydration. His mother hovered nearby, her eyes filled with desperate hope as Sarah examined her son. "He needs fluids immediately," Sarah told the interpreter, "and probably antibiotics. This looks like it could be a serious infection." The mother understood enough English to catch the worry in Sarah's voice. She grabbed Sarah's hands and spoke rapidly in Pashto. "She's asking if you can help her son," the interpreter translated. "She says the nearest doctor is 2 days' walk away, and she doesn't think the boy will survive the journey." Sarah felt her heart breaking. The child reminded her of her nephew back home. The same dark eyes, the same vulnerable expression. She looked at her medical kit, knowing she had everything needed to save this boy's life. "Rodriguez," she called out, "I need to set up an IV. This kid is critically dehydrated." Captain Rodriguez appeared beside her, taking in the situation with a quick glance. Sarah could see the conflict in his eyes. They were on a schedule, and every minute they stayed in one place increased the risk to the patrol. But he also knew Sarah well enough to understand that she wouldn't ask unless it was truly important. "How long?" he asked simply. 20 minutes to stabilize him. Then I can teach his mother how to continue the treatment." Rodriguez nodded curtly. "Do it. But fast." Sarah worked with the focused intensity that had made her reputation at the base. She started an IV line, administered fluids and medication, and monitored the child's vital signs. Within minutes, his breathing became less labored and his color improved. The mother watched every movement Sarah made, asking questions through the interpreter. Sarah showed her how to check for signs of improvement, how to encourage the boy to drink water, and when to seek further help if his condition worsened. He should be much better by tomorrow, Sarah told the woman through the interpreter. But if the fever comes back or if he stops drinking, you must get him to a doctor immediately. The woman pressed something into Sarah's hands, a small, carved wooden bird that looked handmade. Tears were streaming down her face as she spoke rapidly in Pashto. She says you are an angel sent by God, the interpreter translated. She says she will pray for you every day for the rest of her life. Sarah felt her own eyes filling with tears. She squeezed the woman's hands and tried to convey without words that she understood the magnitude of trust that had been placed in her. As the patrol prepared to leave the village, several other residents approached with small gifts, a piece of bread, a handful of dried fruit, a child's drawing of a flower. Sarah realized that word had spread quickly about what she had done for the sick boy. You made quite an impression, Rodriguez observed as they walked back to the vehicles. I just did what any nurse would do. Sarah replied. No, Rodriguez said firmly. Any nurse might have the skills to help that kid, but not every nurse would have been willing to take the risk or make the time. That woman was right about you being an angel. The convoy began the journey back to base as the sun started its descent toward the horizon. Sarah sat quietly in the vehicle, thinking about the sick child and hoping her treatment would be enough. She fingered the small wooden bird in her pocket and wondered about the woman who had carved it. Penny for your thoughts? Sergeant Thompson asked. Sarah smiled. Just hoping that little boy gets better. He will, Thompson said with conviction. I've seen you work. That kid couldn't be in better hands. As they drove through a narrow pass between two hills, Sarah was looking out the window at the rugged landscape when she noticed something that made her stomach drop. On the hillside above them, she could see the brief glint of sunlight reflecting off metal, possibly a weapon scope or binoculars. Rodriguez, she said urgently, pressing the radio button. I think I saw something on the ridge above us. Rodriguez's response was immediate and calm. All units, possible contact on the northern ridge. Maintain spacing and be ready to move. The convoy began to pick up speed, but they were in a narrow valley with limited options for maneuvering. Sarah felt her heart racing as she scanned the hillsides for any sign of movement. That's when she heard the distinctive whistle of incoming mortars. The first mortar round exploded 50 yards to their left, sending up a shower of rocks and dirt. Sarah felt the vehicle lurch as the driver accelerated, trying to get them out of the kill zone. The sound was unlike anything she had ever experienced, a deep, earth-shaking boom that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Contact left. Contact left! Rodriguez's voice crackled through the radio. All units move to cover and return fire. Sarah gripped her medical bag tightly as the vehicle bounced and swayed over the rough terrain. Through the dust-covered windows, she could see muzzle flashes on the ridgeline above them. The Marines in her vehicle were calm but focused, checking their weapons and preparing for combat. Mitchell, Sergeant Thompson shouted over the noise. When we stop, you stay low and stick close to me. Don't try to be a hero. Sarah nodded, her mouth too dry to speak. She had trained for this scenario, but training couldn't prepare someone for the sheer terror of being under fire. Another mortar round exploded, this one closer, and she could hear shrapnel pinging off the vehicle's armor. The convoy reached a slight depression in the terrain that provided some cover from the attackers on the ridge. The vehicles formed a defensive circle, and the Marines quickly dismounted to establish a perimeter. Sarah stayed close to her vehicle, but she could see that the situation was serious. The insurgents had chosen their ambush site well, with multiple covered positions overlooking the route. We've got wounded in Vehicle 3, came the urgent call over the radio. Sarah's training kicked in, overriding her fear. She grabbed her medical kit and started moving toward the third vehicle, staying low and using the other vehicles for cover. Sergeant Thompson was right beside her, his weapon ready. The wounded soldier was Private Martinez, a young Marine from California, whom Sarah had treated for a minor infection just 2 weeks earlier. A piece of shrapnel had caught him in the shoulder and he was bleeding heavily but conscious. Hey, Doc, Martinez said weakly as Sarah knelt beside him. Guess I need another one of your Band-Aids. This is a little more serious than last time, Sarah replied, working to cut away his uniform to expose the wound. The shrapnel had missed the major arteries, but he was losing blood fast and would need surgery once they got back to base. Sarah worked quickly to control the bleeding and start an IV line. Around her, the firefight continued. She could hear the sharp crack of rifle fire and the deeper thump of grenade launchers. The Marines were returning fire with disciplined precision, trying to suppress the enemy positions long enough to call in air support. "How's it looking, Doc?" Captain Rodriguez appeared beside her, having moved from his position to check on the wounded soldier. "He'll be okay if we can get him back to base soon," Sarah replied. "The bleeding is controlled, but he needs surgery to remove the shrapnel properly." Rodriguez nodded. "Air support is 5 minutes out. Once they suppress those positions, we'll move out fast." As if summoned by his words, the sound of jet engines echoed through the valley. Sarah looked up to see 2 fighter aircraft circling high above. Within minutes, the sound of explosions rolled down from the ridge as the aircraft targeted the insurgent positions. The enemy fire slackened, then stopped altogether. Rodriguez made the decision to move immediately, before the insurgents could reposition or bring up reinforcements. The convoy reformed quickly, with the wounded being distributed among the vehicles to balance the load. Sarah rode in the vehicle with Martinez, monitoring his condition as they raced back toward the base. The young Marine was stable but pale, and she could see that he was fighting to stay conscious. "Talk to me, Martinez," Sarah said, checking his pulse again. "Tell me about that girlfriend of yours back in San Diego." Martinez smiled weakly. "Maria, she's studying to be a teacher. We're going to get married when I get back home." His voice was getting weaker, and Sarah could see that he was going into shock despite her efforts to maintain his blood pressure. "Stay with me," Sarah said firmly. "Maria's going to want you in one piece when you get home." As they approached the base, Sarah could see the medical team waiting for them. Lieutenant Collins and one of the doctors were standing by with a stretcher, ready to take Martinez straight to surgery. Sarah had called ahead on the radio to give them a full report on his condition and the treatment she had provided. The handoff went smoothly, and within minutes Martinez was in the operating room. Sarah stood outside the medical tent, still covered in dust and blood, watching through the window as the surgical team worked to save her patient's life. "Good work out there," Rodriguez said, appearing beside her with 2 bottles of water. He handed her one and they both drank deeply. "Will he be okay?" Sarah asked. "The doc thinks so. You did everything right. If you hadn't been there to control the bleeding and get that IV started, we might have lost him." Sarah nodded, but she was thinking about more than just Martinez. The ambush had been well planned and executed. The insurgents had known the route the patrol would take and had positioned themselves perfectly to inflict maximum damage. If not for the quick response of the air support, the outcome could have been much worse. "This was different from the other attacks, wasn't it?" Sarah asked. Rodriguez's expression grew serious. "Yeah, this wasn't just harassment fire or a target of opportunity. They were waiting for us specifically, which means they either got lucky with their timing or they knew we were coming," Sarah finished. The implications of that possibility hung heavy in the air between them. If the insurgents had intelligence about patrol schedules and routes, it meant the base was facing a much more serious threat than random attacks. Over the next several hours, intelligence officers debriefed every member of the patrol. Sarah was questioned extensively about what she had observed during the ambush, particularly her initial sighting of the reflection on the ridge. The officers were professional but intense, clearly concerned about the security implications. That evening, Sarah sat in the medical tent with Martinez, who had come through surgery successfully. The shrapnel had been removed, and while he would need several weeks to recover fully, the doctors expected him to make a complete recovery. "Thanks, Doc," Martinez said as Sarah checked his bandages. "The surgeon said if you hadn't stopped the bleeding when you did, I would have been in real trouble." "Just doing my job," Sarah replied. But she felt a deep satisfaction at seeing her patient alert and talking. "My mom always told me that angels watch over soldiers," Martinez said quietly. I think she was right. Sarah felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment. "Get some rest. You need to heal up so Maria doesn't have to worry about you anymore." As Sarah walked back to her quarters that night, she reflected on how much her life had changed since arriving at the base. She had come to Afghanistan thinking she understood what she was getting into. But every day brought new challenges and new realizations about the complexity of the situation. The attack had shown her that the danger was real and immediate, but it had also shown her that she was capable of functioning under pressure, of making life and death decisions when there was no time for doubt. The young nurse who had arrived 3 months ago, nervous and uncertain, was gone. In her place was someone stronger, more confident, and more committed than ever to the mission of caring for the soldiers who depended on her. But Sarah had no way of knowing that the ambush was just the beginning. Intelligence reports were coming in suggesting a major offensive was being planned, and forward operating base Chapman was likely to be one of the primary targets. The quiet routine of base life was about to be shattered, and Sarah would soon face the greatest test of her career and her courage. The intelligence reports proved accurate. Over the next week, forward operating base Chapman came under increasing pressure. Mortar attacks became a daily occurrence. Probing raids tested the perimeter defenses, and the medical team found themselves treating more wounded soldiers than ever before. Sarah had stopped counting the hours she worked, moving from crisis to crisis with barely enough time to grab a meal or change her uniform. The strain was showing on everyone. Soldiers moved with the tense alertness of people who knew they were being hunted. Conversations became shorter, focused on immediate necessities. Even the usual jokes and casual banter that helped everyone cope with the stress had largely disappeared. Captain Rodriguez found Sarah in the medical tent at 2 a.m, cleaning blood off surgical instruments after treating 3 wounded soldiers from a night patrol that had been hit by an improvised explosive device. "When's the last time you slept?" Rodriguez asked, though he already knew the answer from the exhaustion written across her face. "I'll sleep when things calm down," Sarah replied, not looking up from her work. "That's what you said 3 days ago." Rodriguez sat down on the stool across from her. "The attacks are going to continue, probably get worse before they get better. You can't help anyone if you collapse from exhaustion." Sarah finally looked up at him. Rodriguez looked as tired as she felt, with dark circles under his eyes and the kind of tension that came from making life and death decisions every day for weeks on end. "How many wounded do we have now?" Sarah asked. 11 in the medical ward, plus 6 who were evacuated to Germany yesterday. Rodriguez's voice was grim. "Intelligence thinks this is building up to something bigger, a coordinated attack on the base itself." The possibility had been in the back of Sarah's mind for days, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that was both frightening and clarifying. If insurgents were planning a direct assault on forward operating base Chapman, every person on the base would be in immediate danger. "What's the plan?" Sarah asked. "Reinforce the perimeter, bring in additional troops and air support, and hope we can hold until relief arrives." Rodriguez paused. "There's something else. Command is offering to evacuate non-essential personnel before things get worse." Sarah understood immediately what he was telling her. As a civilian contractor, she could be evacuated along with other support personnel who weren't critical to the base's defense. "It would be the safe choice, the smart choice. Am I being ordered to leave?" she asked. "No, the medical team needs you. But if you want to go, no one would blame you. This isn't what you signed up for." Sarah thought about the conversation for a long moment. Rodriguez was right. This wasn't what she had signed up for. She had come to Afghanistan to help wounded soldiers, not to fight in a battle for the survival of an entire base. She could leave with honor, go back to her safe job in Ohio, and let someone else deal with what was coming. But then she thought about Martinez, recovering from his surgery, about Sergeant Thompson, who brought her coffee every morning, about Corporal Williams, who worried about his mother's health, about all the soldiers who had become her family over the past months. "I'm staying," Sarah said firmly. Rodriguez smiled for the first time in days. "I thought you'd say that, but I had to ask." The next morning brought an ominous quiet. The usual mortar attacks didn't come, and the radio intercepts that intelligence monitored went silent. Everyone on the base knew what this meant. The enemy was preparing for something big. Sarah spent the morning preparing the medical facility for mass casualties. She inventoried supplies, set up additional surgical stations, and briefed the medical team on emergency protocols. If the base came under direct assault, they would need to be ready to treat large numbers of wounded simultaneously. Lieutenant Collins worked beside her, organizing blood supplies and checking emergency equipment. "You know," she said quietly, "in 20 years of military nursing, I've never seen anyone adapt to this environment the way you have. The soldiers trust you completely." "They're good people," Sarah replied simply. "They deserve the best care we can give them." At noon, the attack began. It started with a massive mortar barrage that shook the entire base. Sarah was in the medical tent when the first rounds hit, and she immediately threw herself to the ground as explosions rocked the compound. The lights went out as the generators were hit and emergency lighting kicked in, casting everything in an eerie red glow. All medical personnel, Prepare for mass casualties. Lieutenant Collins shouted over the noise. This is not a drill. Through the tent walls, Sarah could hear the sound of small arms fire as insurgents attacked the perimeter. The base's defensive weapons responded with a steady hammering that made the ground vibrate. She had never experienced anything like the sheer volume of gunfire that was now echoing through the compound. The first wounded soldiers began arriving within minutes. They came in waves, some walking, some carried by their buddies, some brought in on stretchers by medics who had risked their lives to reach them under fire. Sarah moved from patient to patient, triaging injuries and directing treatment with the calm efficiency that had become second nature. Private Johnson, the young soldier she had saved during her first week at the base, was among the wounded. He had been hit by shrapnel in both legs but was conscious and alert. "Hey, Doc," he said with a weak smile as Sarah examined his wounds. "Looks like you get to patch me up again." "This is getting to be a habit with you," Sarah replied, working to control the bleeding. "You're going to be fine, but you need to stop collecting shrapnel." As Sarah worked on Johnson, she could hear Captain Rodriguez's voice on the radio, coordinating the base's defense. The insurgents had attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, and the fighting was intense. Several buildings had been hit by mortars and part of the perimeter wall had been breached. "Doc, we need you over here," one of the medics called out. "Multiple casualties from the communications bunker." Sarah quickly finished stabilizing Johnson and moved to the new patients. The communications bunker had taken a direct hit from a mortar round, and 3 soldiers had been trapped in the collapsed structure. 2 had serious crush injuries, and 1 was unconscious with a severe head wound. Working in the dim emergency lighting, Sarah and the medical team fought to save lives while the battle raged around them. The sound of explosions was constant now, punctuated by the sharp crack of sniper fire and the deeper boom of the base's defensive artillery. Sergeant Thompson appeared in the medical tent, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead. "Doc, we need you outside," he said urgently. "Rodriguez is down." Sarah felt her heart stop. "How bad?" "Bad." He was coordinating the defense of the north wall when a mortar round hit nearby. "He's unconscious and losing blood fast." Sarah grabbed her field medical kit and followed Thompson outside. The scene was chaos. Smoke and dust filled the air, soldiers were running between positions, and the sound of gunfire was overwhelming. She could see muzzle flashes from insurgent positions beyond the perimeter, and tracer rounds were streaking through the darkness. Rodriguez was lying behind a concrete barrier, with 2 Marines providing security while a medic worked on his injuries. Sarah could see immediately that his condition was critical. He had multiple shrapnel wounds and had lost a dangerous amount of blood. "Talk to me," Sarah said to the medic as she knelt beside Rodriguez. "Shrapnel to the abdomen and left leg. Blood pressure is dropping fast and he's been unconscious for 5 minutes. I've got pressure on the worst bleeding, but he needs surgery now." Sarah quickly assessed Rodriguez's condition. He was going into shock, and without immediate surgical intervention, he would die. But moving him back to the medical tent would mean exposing him to additional fire. And the tent itself wasn't safe from the mortar attacks. "We need to stop the bleeding here," Sarah decided. "I can't wait to get him back to the tent." Working under fire, with explosions going off nearby and bullets occasionally striking the concrete barrier above their heads, Sarah performed emergency surgery to save Rodriguez's life. She opened his abdomen to find and repair the damaged blood vessels, working by the light of a tactical flashlight held by one of the Marines. It was the most challenging medical procedure of her career, made infinitely more difficult by the combat conditions. Her hands were steady despite the chaos around her, focused entirely on the delicate work of saving her friend's life. "Doc, we've got movement on the east wall," one of the Marines called out. "They're trying to breach the perimeter." Sarah could hear the fighting intensifying, but she couldn't stop now. Rodriguez's life depended on her completing the surgery successfully. She worked with desperate concentration, blocking out everything except the immediate task in front of her. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, Sarah managed to control the internal bleeding and stabilize Rodriguez's condition. He was still unconscious, but his blood pressure was improving and the immediate danger had passed. "We need to get him back to the medical tent now," Sarah told the Marines. "And I need to get back to the other wounded." As they prepared to move Rodriguez, Sarah suddenly felt dizzy. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the emergency surgery was wearing off, and she realized she hadn't eaten or rested in nearly 18 hours. The stress of working under fire, combined with her existing exhaustion, was finally catching up with her. "Doc, you okay?" Sergeant Thompson asked, noticing her wavering on her feet. "I'm fine," Sarah said, though she wasn't sure that was true. "Let's get Rodriguez to safety." They made their way back to the medical tent through the ongoing battle, staying low and moving quickly between covered positions. Sarah's vision was starting to blur, and she was having trouble focusing, but Rodriguez needed surgery, and there were other wounded soldiers who needed her care. As they reached the medical tent, Sarah felt the world starting to spin around her. She had pushed herself beyond her physical limits, and her body was finally demanding the rest she had denied it for so long. The last thing she remembered was handing Rodriguez's medical chart to Lieutenant Collins and trying to explain his condition. Then everything went black and Sarah collapsed to the floor of the medical tent unconscious. When Sarah opened her eyes, the first thing she noticed was the silence. After days of constant gunfire and explosions, the quiet was almost unsettling. She was lying in a hospital bed in what appeared to be a much larger medical facility than the tent at Forward Operating Base Chapman. Sunlight was streaming through actual windows, and she could hear the distant sound of aircraft engines rather than artillery. "Welcome back to the land of the living," a familiar voice said from beside her bed. Sarah turned her head to see Captain Rodriguez sitting in a wheelchair next to her bed. He was pale and had bandages visible under his hospital gown, but he was alive and alert. The relief that flooded through her was so intense that she felt tears forming in her eyes. "Rodriguez," she said, her voice hoarse from sleep. "You're okay." "Thanks to you," Rodriguez replied. "The doctors here said your field surgery saved my life. If you hadn't stopped that internal bleeding when you did, I wouldn't have made it to the evacuation helicopter." Sarah tried to sit up but felt dizzy immediately. "How long have I been unconscious?" 3 days. You collapsed from exhaustion and dehydration right after they brought me into the medical tent. The doctor said you had pushed your body well beyond its limits." Rodriguez's expression grew serious. "Sarah, do you remember what happened after you collapsed?" Sarah shook her head, trying to piece together her last clear memories. She remembered working on Rodriguez behind the concrete barrier, the sound of gunfire getting him back to the medical tent, and then nothing. "You passed out while Lieutenant Collins was trying to get a status report on my condition," Rodriguez explained. "The attack was still going on. The medical tent was dealing with dozens of casualties, and suddenly their best trauma nurse was unconscious on the floor." "Oh, God," Sarah said, feeling a wave of guilt. "I left everyone when they needed me most." "No," Rodriguez said firmly. "You had already done more than anyone could reasonably expect. But what happened next, Sarah? You became a legend." Before Sarah could ask what he meant, the door to her room opened and a man in a general's uniform entered, followed by several other officers she didn't recognize. Sarah struggled to sit up straighter, unsure of protocol when meeting high-ranking officers while wearing a hospital gown. "Nurse Mitchell," the general said, approaching her bed with a smile. "I'm General Morrison. I've been very much looking forward to meeting you." "Sir?" Sarah replied, still confused about what was happening. "Let me tell you a story," General Morrison said, pulling up a chair. 3 days ago, word reached me that Forward Operating Base Chapman was under coordinated attack and that they had sustained significant casualties. When I got the detailed after-action reports, one name kept appearing over and over again. The general paused, looking directly at Sarah. "Every wounded soldier we evacuated from that base had the same thing to say. They said there was a nurse who had risked her life repeatedly to save theirs, a nurse who had performed emergency surgery under fire, who had worked for days without rest, who had treated wounded soldiers in the middle of a firefight." Sarah felt her cheeks burning with embarrassment. "I was just doing my job, sir." "No," General Morrison said. "You did far more than your job. You exemplified the very best of what it means to serve others, even at great personal risk." He stood up and nodded to one of the other officers, who stepped forward with a small wooden box. "Nurse Sarah Mitchell," the general said formally, "by the authority vested in me by the President of the United States, I hereby award you the Civilian Service Commendation Medal for exceptional courage and dedication to duty under combat conditions." Sarah stared at the medal in shock. She had never expected any kind of recognition for what she had done. In her mind, she had simply responded to emergencies as any medical professional would. There's more, Rodriguez said, grinning despite his injuries. Tell her about the ceremony, General. General Morrison smiled. When word spread about what you had done at Chapman, it reached units throughout the region. Marines, soldiers, airmen, and sailors all heard the story of the nurse who had saved their brothers and sisters under fire. They wanted to show their appreciation. The general gestured toward the window. Look outside, Nurse Mitchell. Sarah slowly got out of bed, steadying herself on Rodriguez's wheelchair, and walked to the window. What she saw took her breath away. The courtyard of the medical facility was filled with hundreds of military personnel. They were standing in formation, but as soon as they saw her at the window, they began to applaud. The sound was thunderous, echoing off the buildings around the courtyard. 500 Marines, soldiers, and other service members. General Morrison said quietly behind her, all here to honor you. Sarah watched in amazement as the crowd below continued applauding. She could see faces from Forward Operating Base Chapman, mixed in with hundreds of others she didn't recognize. Sergeant Thompson was there, standing tall and proud. Corporal Williams was clapping enthusiastically. Even Private Martinez was there, still on crutches but smiling broadly. I don't understand, Sarah said, wiping tears from her eyes. I'm not military. I'm just a nurse who wanted to help. That's exactly why this matters so much, Rodriguez said from behind her. You didn't have to be here. You chose to be here. You chose to put yourself in danger to take care of people you barely knew. And when things got really bad, you didn't run. You stayed and fought to save lives. As Sarah watched, the crowd below began to chant her name. Mitchell, Mitchell, Mitchell. The sound filled the courtyard and seemed to shake the building itself. General Morrison placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. You may think you're just a nurse, but to these men and women, you're a hero. You represent the best of what it means to serve others regardless of the uniform you wear or don't wear. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the emotion of the moment. She had come to Afghanistan thinking she would help a few wounded soldiers and then return to her quiet life in Ohio. She had never imagined that her actions would have such an impact on so many people. What happens now? Sarah asked. Now you have a choice, General Morrison replied. You can return home and no one would blame you after what you've been through. Or, if you're willing, there are other bases where your skills and dedication would be invaluable. Sarah looked out at the crowd of service members still applauding below. She thought about her comfortable life back in Ohio, her family, her friends, the safety and predictability of her old job. Then she thought about the soldiers who had become her family, the patients who needed her skills, and the profound sense of purpose she had found in this unlikely place. I'd like to stay, Sarah said quietly. There's still work to do. Rodriguez reached over and squeezed her hand. I thought you'd say that. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Sarah remained at the window, watching the service members return to their duties. She knew that her life had been permanently changed by her experience at Forward Operating Base Chapman. She was no longer the nervous young nurse who had arrived in Afghanistan months ago. She had discovered reserves of strength and courage she never knew she possessed. But more importantly, she had learned that heroism wasn't about being fearless or perfect. It was about showing up when people needed you, even when you were scared. It was about doing the right thing, even when it was difficult or dangerous. It was about putting others before yourself, not because you had to, but because you chose to. The wooden bird that the Afghan mother had given her was sitting on the bedside table, a reminder of why she had made these choices. Sarah picked it up and held it gently, thinking about the sick child she had treated and wondering how he was doing now. Tomorrow she would begin preparing for her next assignment. There would be other bases, other wounded soldiers, other opportunities to make a difference. The work would be challenging and sometimes dangerous, but Sarah had found her calling. She had come to Afghanistan as a nurse. She was leaving as something more, a symbol of dedication, courage, and the profound difference that one person could make when they chose to serve others above themselves. The applause of 500 Marines would echo in her heart for the rest of her life, but more important than the recognition was the knowledge that she had lived up to the trust placed in her by people who depended on her skills and compassion. Sarah's story would be told and retold in military circles for years to come, inspiring other medical professionals to volunteer for dangerous assignments and reminding everyone who heard it that heroism comes in many forms. But for Sarah herself, the greatest reward was simpler: the knowledge that when people needed her most, she had been there, ready to serve.